NATO was designed to last 10 years. It lasted 77. In our latest Substack article, we look into the structure of NATO, the foundational principles of the alliance, and map them against the actions of the Trump administration to find that essentially all but one of the foundational principles of NATO have been inverted by the very country that was supposed to lead it. What's more, when you zoom out, you see that the world for which NATO was built has also changed significantly. Almost nothing is exactly the same as it was 77 years ago. As Eric is out on his vacation in Ireland, in this episode, Jana and I wrestle with the critiques of NATO, of the methodology and the analysis that we use, and go deeper into the topic of the beacon and the difference between what a beacon is, as we talk about it in our own framework that we have laid out in our book, If Not This Then What, and what a vision is in how we talk about visions and missions of organizations in everyday life, and how one is very, very different from the other, even though they sound similar. So let's jump in. Okay. So I think we can start off with the question that maybe there are a lot of people in today's world that think that Trump and the Trump administration's policies are a little bit of a blip in the radar. I mean, we're already talking about the midterm elections in the US and how, maybe the Democrats will take control of the Senate, it is, I guess. But and so you might say, okay, you want us to redesign an organization like NATO for what could be a temporary change. And that could be, you could broaden that critique out to just the tool that we use is the reality canvas. It isn't supposed to, and it doesn't really show a change or evolution in reality over time. It really is reality as is. And yeah, as is, it might not really fit and it might look like NATO and all its fundamental essences have inverted. But what if it is temporary? How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, indeed. And in that sense, everything is temporary. So that's something we have to solve anyway. I see it more like preparing for the real changes. So most changes and changing many manifestations takes time. So it's it won't happen overnight anyways. So you have to do it step by step. So and in that sense, the temporariness obviously is always an aspect of of your view on reality. But what I think the analysis clearly shows it is that there are quite some inconsistencies now.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the situation was really different. It was really different during Joe Biden's presidency, but a number of things obviously also changed. So the outlook on the rest of the world has changed. The role of China, the role of Russia, dependence on energy, on material. So I think it's a matter of good governance to be prepared and to consider a lot of changes and possible changes.
Yep, indeed. So we did take both, and that's probably another reason to take both the zoomed in and the zoomed out view. So indeed, when the zoomed in view looks like, oh yeah, the change is temporary because it's just all the stuff that Trump is saying, maybe not necessarily doing. But the zoomed out view is independent of Trump. Everything has changed, and so there is no reason for the organization itself to remain the same.
Yeah, indeed. And then that could be an analysis or a start of an analysis like, hey, if we zoom out indeed and the relation to the zoomed out reality, what does that tell us about the primary goal of NATO? What does that tell us about how to organize?
Yeah.
But of course, the NATO is indeed a solution to a problem in 1949. Yeah, so you could argue that the way it was set up, indeed, chances that it's an effective solution for the troubles that we have now, those chances are very low. So it should change anyway. Yeah, or just get rid of it, or well, at least don't make it as important anymore, and get to something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but then all of the policies or the actions, I guess, that Mark Rutte is pushing for, whether it's the military spending, whether it's the opening of the air bases, whether it's all sorts of other things, buying weapons from the US, that is actively then damaging efforts. That's also one of the points that we make in the article, that these things take time, but then every euro or every second that we spend on trying to keep things intact is time and euros kept away from coming to a better solution.
Yeah, sure. And then, it's a damage control strategy. Well, on not offending the US, but indeed that certainly damages capabilities to really change.
Actually, that reminds me, it was last week that there was this news story about I think it was Cyprus that wanted promises or wanted a commitment from the UK that in case the Farage government comes to power, that the UK military bases in Cyprus would not be used for military action against the Middle East. So they wanted to Farage proof, they called it. I think the headline was the military bases. And so you might argue also there is a lot of there's a lot of dynamics going on, and we only scratched the surface of it with the available information that we found, and of course the little bit of research that we did. But maybe that's the next question that I wanted to go into, because of course what we tried to do is to analyze using our framework the situation, both the zoomed in version of the NATO but also the zoomed out. And then what we did was we inverted, as we do in our framework, the top most essences of NATO. So what's the purpose of the organization? What's the identity of its members? And how do you govern the organization? Now, these are like the highest level essences, as we call them, of the system of this NATO reality, or the reality of this organization called NATO. That might be relatively easy to sort of figure out, but the main problems really start coming up during the design phase, during the phase where you're inverting different essences. Even when you go into the lower detailed levels, you could still do it with relative ease because it's just a thinking exercise. But if you were to put yourself in Mark Rutte's shoes, what we are effectively sort of arguing for, and correct me if you think differently, is that a set of allies in NATO start thinking about something different, maybe perhaps without the US, or at least triggered by the US. Now, how does an organization actually achieve that? How does the Secretary General of an organization achieve that, even if you were to come to a coherent new reality? So I think maybe the bigger question that I wanted to pose to you is, what happens after you invert the top layers of the reality canvas? How do you go about going into detail, executing on all of this? What's the next step?
Yeah, so that involves the people that really know those next levels. And of course, they should be open to the change. That's one thing. But okay, that's also a matter of leadership. But I guess then you really go on this iterative journey where you have to accept that you don't know all next steps, but you have to find out by exploring and by putting together your collective knowledge, by exploring the alternatives, by addressing the resistance of all people at the table, and then just persevere. So then, and it sounds way easier than it is, obviously. But then the trick is to have the vision of the high level changes that you need to do, and make sure that you have good people around you, such that you can also iterate through the lower level inversions that you need to do. And my that's a more mathematically inclined statement, but chances to get it right are higher if you change more, or at least are open, are willing to consider to change more. Then that just expands your solution space in mathematical terms. So that's maybe a bit theoretical, but I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah. Going to that point of changing more, I wonder if you have a thought on, we know that, Russell Eckhoff in his idealized design process also says, start from scratch. Like just pretend that whatever existed up until yesterday was burned down to the ground and is not able to be salvaged, and then start from scratch. Going by that logic, wouldn't it be better to then just dissolve NATO? Of course, we're talking about NATO because that's what we wrote about in the article, but in general, what's your view on just starting from scratch instead of trying to redesign or rethink something that exists?
Nah, I'm not so fond of starting from a blank sheet of paper. I also find that hard to do in any of the kind of transitions work that I'm involved in myself. There's always a current situation and people with knowledge, organizational structures. You shouldn't take them too serious. That's for sure. But you should take them at least a little serious. You shouldn't take them too serious in the sense that you cannot change them, but they are there for a reason. So that you should take serious. And then, and now there was this famous statement from Mark Rutte, and it was maybe a bit carried too far, and he got back to that later, that he's not a man of a vision. But then I think for building a future-proof NATO or a future-proof non-NATO alternative, you should have at least some vision or some beacon for what's needed in this new reality.
Yeah. Yeah. That actually points me to, it's an interesting question because Mark Rutte doesn't come across as the visionary leader. Even in his political career in the Netherlands, he was known as a great manager of things and keeping things stable. You could argue that, we talk about resistance when we talk about new realities. We talk about different people in the reality that need to sort of accept a common sort of vision of that reality. And there you could argue political skill is very important, and that's kind of what Mark Rutte has. I guess I'm asking you, how do you reconcile the two? Because when we talk about dilemmas and beacons, we talk about the fact that beacons will help you resolve a dilemma by giving you the guiding principle by which to make those trade-offs. Whereas the political career and sort of negotiations are about meeting in the middle, and almost like nobody wins and everybody gets a little bit of something, or what is it? I think it's making sure that the most number of the people are the least unhappy, something like that. What's the right technique when you're making a change from an old reality to a new reality?
Yeah, Mark Rutte must have a team around him, and he must consult with the leaders of Europe regularly. So it might be that there is a vision, maybe not originated in his mind, but that doesn't really matter. And then he certainly has the skills to make people, seduce people to do what is needed for that. So in that he's quite skillful. But then it depends on this vision that's at least not clear now. Huh? You could say he's not a leader in that sense, but he might be following a vision that is not yet known to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think if that's the case, he could be very good at it. He showed that during his premierschap in the Netherlands.
It almost feels like you cannot have a transition from an old reality to a new reality without a vision. Yeah, a vision is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a transition from an old to a new.
Yeah, I think that's true, and we call it a beacon.
Yeah. But that's an interesting point that I think probably bears a little bit of emphasis. It just struck me that we use in our conversation with each other, we're talking about beacon and vision is relatively similar, and to a certain extent it is, but a beacon is much more pointed and sharp, because vision, and that's usually how the word is used in business and politics, perhaps, and in our everyday language, is this sort of blurry, sometimes clear, vivid view of a certain reality, but it isn't comprehensive. And that implies that when we think about a vision, we think about all of the desirable things we want in our reality, but we are not capable, or we purposely try not to think about the necessary flip side of the coin that will accompany those desirable aspects, because no reality is perfect. Even our current reality isn't perfect. But when we think about a vision, a quote unquote vision that is a desirable world, it's almost going to disappoint by definition, because we haven't thought about the undesirable aspects or features of that reality that come with that vision, as opposed to a beacon, which is much more pointed. How would you articulate the beacon then when you compare it to the vision the way I've described it?
Yeah, I totally agree. A vision can be a bit of a dream, and those fancy smancy visions that you read on websites of huge organizations, they never really like make your heart tick any faster. Huh? And then you could say then indeed that's a kind of a dream, or even a lie in that sense, that a fairy tale. So for me, at least, it's always much clearer what is meant if you say the not of something in the current reality. So, for instance, as you know, I'm working on circularity for this big industry around here, and then circularity would be the vision. And I honestly don't really know what's meant by that. Of course, I
Yeah.
do know, but it's still vague. And if you say, okay, it should be non-linear, there should not be any new material coming into this industry, yeah, that to me is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Of course, then it's not yet clear how to do that and how to implement that, but that's a very clear guidance, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah, that's a big difference, and I think maybe we also should probably be a little bit more conscious about the words that we use as synonyms with the beacon, because it's quite different in the way we have used words like vision or mission before. Do you think our obsession with visions, or some idea of a reality, or circular in this case, is because of the discomfort that we as humans have of just not knowing what we are going towards? I mean, we are like having goals, and that's the way we've lived our lives for decades, if not longer. And so going away from something but not knowing what it's towards is a very uncomfortable mental situation to be in.
Yeah, apparently that's the case, huh? So, and if you really don't know where you're going, then of course that's a very insecure situation. So, then it's a task to address this insecurity and to really define then what it is that we do know and what it is that we don't know, and have a maybe roadmap to find out.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe many people wouldn't agree here, but I think there's also security in a decision on what you want to leave.
Yeah. Okay, talking about human psyche, there is this other critique that you yourself, I think I remember when we were writing the article, came up with, to say you could argue that, our map, or our reality canvas of NATO, was a lie to begin with. I mean, the treaty was 1,000 words. It could barely represent the complex organization that NATO is. It never really functioned the way it said it would in the treaty. In the treaty, all the allies were equal. And yes, to a certain extent, governance is consensus based, but America was always the de facto sort of leader. And so the entire reality was fake. So surprise, surprise, it isn't really such a big insight that it doesn't hold anymore. But it does point to a deeper sort of aspect of human behavior, where whether we're talking about the reality or whether we're talking about our honesty about the beacon, sometimes there are realities that exist that we just don't want to see. Sometimes there are beacons that we don't want to accept that they are our beacons, even though that's what drives all our actions, but it's just not. I don't know whether it's discomfort or some other self-esteem based reason for why we don't want to accept it. The question is, what happens when you want to sort of cling on to an idea of a reality?
Yeah,
How do you even go about mapping what the actual reality is, instead of the version that we tell ourselves that we're in?
yeah, yeah. That's a very good question. Well, I think what we should acknowledge is that there at least is a reality that everybody can talk about and have his or her view on. And that's very often a romanticized or a pessimistic or a idealized view on reality.
Mm,
So that doesn't mean that a reality canvas is useless,
mm,
but it points to at least, so it should be a good starting point for a discussion on then what could be a shared reality canvas. So if we dream up a reality canvas of NATO, then yeah, it's only true to a certain extent. And it's people working in NATO will see it differently. At least they will have insights that we won't. They will have a valuable information that could really add to the total view on reality. But that doesn't mean that it's useless. And uh, uh, yeah, it's a tool to help you out. So it's not a tool to cover up in that sense. At least that's not how I would use it.
yeah.
So it could be a starting point for a conversation, and then if someone says, and it might be very true that this is a very idealistic picture of NATO.
Mm,
Yes, but then we adapt the canvas and say, okay, so there's apparently it's important that there's an informal leader,
yeah.
and then what does that have as consequences if you zoom out and if you zoom in?
Yeah.
It's in that sense just a model.
Yeah, at the very least, what the reality canvas does is put these things in black and white. Things like the identity of the organization. Because I'm thinking, I mean, we're talking about NATO in the article, but every company, and I've done it, I've been guilty of it as well. When you're working in a company, you kind of are sort of brainwashed with the narrative of the company. So when I worked in this large scale agricultural sort of food ingredient producer, yeah, it was bad on many, many levels, but that was just not a part of my reality that I really wanted to look at. I think a lot of employees in OpenAI or in Meta actually think that they are still doing good for the world because the other side is just not what they want to look at. But once you start, yeah, putting these things down, triangle by triangle, and you can't sort of ignore it because you'll probably get stuck as you start detailing it out because you can only hold the lie for a certain number of levels after which as you get deeper into the reality canvas it just doesn't cohere anymore. So, for listeners who got a little confused about my digression into triangles and different levels, I'm really talking about the reality canvas, which is a tool that we've talked about in our book, If Not This, Then What? And it is a mapping tool to map the fundamental building blocks of reality. The tool itself is based on something called the Sierpinski triangle, which is a fractal. I'll spare you the details, but essentially, every fundamental building block of reality is mapped in a specific triangle. And these triangles are placed at the different hierarchical levels of reality or any complex system. It sounds a little bit complicated, but it really isn't. It's one of the most simple systems mapping tools that exists. If you'd like to find out more, you can go onto our website, ifnotthisThenWhat.com, and download the reality canvas for free. We've explained how to use it in our book, but also we use it regularly in all our articles and analyses on Substack. So you'll find the multi-layered triangular mapping of reality in most things that we write. Now back to the conversation.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Then it's maybe even a kind of self-help tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a discovery tool for indeed, well, lies is maybe too big of a word, but
Mm,
things that we don't want to talk about. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure, for sure. And there is a lot of value in having a model of reality and thinking about it and being able to explore together what we should do about it. But that doesn't mean that it can only be good if it's perfect or if it's fast or if it's efficient.
Then your answer is yes, we all sort of have a certain idea of what we want our reality to be. We all continuously discover. I mean, that's why many of us go to therapists because there's a big part of our reality that we don't actually know, at least not in detail or not explicitly. So the very exercise, whether or not perhaps you want to change things, it is good to have the exercise of understanding the structure of your reality, if nothing else than to reveal the actual reality as is and to discover more and more of it, yeah, that might mean that we are confronted with something that we didn't want to confront, but it's better to know and deal with it than to not and be under that impression forever and then be unable to change because we were never clear about our reality in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And I'm actually confident that people, leaders of NATO countries are considering this. But that would be my hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And if they need inspiration, they can call us.
Yeah. 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 We've got I think that's what we should end every episode with.
Yeah.
So that's where we landed. The reality canvas is just a model. It's a starting point for a conversation. It's not the final word of what a reality is. But that's exactly why it's useful, because it forces you to put things in black and white, triangle by triangle, building block by building block, and force a comprehensive picture of the reality to emerge, not just the parts that we want to think about. Join us again in 2 weeks when we will be discussing a very interesting topic, talking about how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights might be to blame for the climate crisis that we see today. Hope to see you then.